My name is Lauren Miller. I am 29 years old, and I used to think Christmas dinners at my parents' house were just noisy gatherings filled with food and chatter. But year after year, those evenings turned into something else, a stage where my father reminded everyone who he thought held the power. I stayed quiet for a long time, carrying the weight of secrets that no one else saw. Until one Christmas, when his voice thundered across the table, I finally stood up. What happened in that moment left the whole room frozen, and it is a story you will want to hear until the very end. Let me take you back to where it began. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles filled the house, but even with the glittering lights on the tree and the polished silver on the dining table, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. Christmas dinner at my parents' home in Columbus was supposed to be warm and joyful, yet every year it turned into a stage where my father performed. I had just turned 29, still teaching third grade at Lincoln Elementary, and while I loved my students and felt proud of the life I was building, I knew tonight would be no different than the years before. My father, Robert Miller, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a glass of red wine in his hand, his voice already carrying louder than anyone else's. He gestured toward the gifts stacked by the fireplace and bragged about how generous he had been this year, how he had made sure no one left empty-handed. I sat there quietly staring at the gold ribbons and shiny wrapping paper, knowing full well many of those presents had been bought with my debit card. I had ordered them online, wrapped them myself, and watched the balance in my checking account drop lower than it should have. My cousin Jessica leaned over to admire a necklace her fiancé had just unwrapped, and my Aunt Patricia nodded approvingly at my father's story about finding it in a downtown jewelry shop. I kept my mouth shut, letting him soak in the praise. If I said the truth, the evening would collapse before it had even started. I took a sip of water, trying to steady my nerves. The dishes were being passed around: sweet potato casserole, green beans, cranberry sauce. My mother moved quickly from chair to chair, making sure plates were filled, never challenging. My father never breaking the rhythm of his performance. As he carved the turkey, his voice grew sharper, his eyes scanning the table until they landed on me. For a moment he smiled, but then he leaned back and shook his head. "Do not embarrass me again," he snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You make me look weak when you run your mouth." The clink of silverware stopped. My Uncle Tom's fork froze mid-air. Jessica's fiancé lowered his glass. Even Ethan, my younger brother, who usually sat with a smirk, kept his eyes on his plate. Heat rushed to my face, but I sat still, pressing my hands against my lap to keep them from shaking. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. I felt every eye at the table on me, waiting to see if I would respond, waiting to see if I would shrink back or stand tall. My breath felt heavy in my chest. The Christmas lights twinkled behind him, casting a glow that felt almost cruel in its cheerfulness. The house was beautiful, the table set perfectly, yet in that moment, all I could feel was the weight of humiliation pressing down on me. My father leaned back with the confidence of a man who thought the matter was settled. He raised his glass again, cleared his throat, and shifted the conversation to my brother Ethan's graduate program. Everyone murmured politely, but the tension did not lift. It hung in the room like smoke. I stabbed at the cranberry sauce on my plate, listening, as he praised Ethan for being so ambitious, for studying engineering, for carrying the family name with pride. I wondered if anyone noticed that Ethan's tuition checks had cleared from my account. Of course, no one would mention it. My mother smiled tightly, her eyes darting between us, but she did not speak. She never did. In her world, it was easier to keep the peace, to serve the mashed potatoes, to laugh when Robert told his jokes, even if everyone had already heard them. Jessica tried to lighten the mood by telling a story about her job at the hospital, about a patient who had given her flowers the week before. Her fiancé Michael beamed with pride as she spoke. I forced a smile, wishing I could disappear under the tablecloth. The truth was, I loved Jessica. She had always been kind to me, but every time we were together, I became the unspoken comparison. Jessica, the nurse, engaged to a promising doctor, building a bright future. Me, the teacher living at home, silently funding the very lifestyle my father bragged about. Uncle Tom cleared his throat and asked about my classroom, giving me a chance to speak. I described how my students had made paper snowflakes to decorate the school hallway, how their faces lit up when we read holiday stories together. For a moment, warmth spread through me. Then my father cut in with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Teaching little kids is fine," he said, "but it is not a career that builds anything." I raised her to aim higher. The words sliced through me, sharper than the carving knife on the turkey. I lowered my eyes to my plate again, letting the silence swallow me. I wanted to scream that my work mattered, that the children whose lives I touched were proof of my worth, but I stayed quiet. The conversation limped forward. Jessica's fiancé asked my father about his years in construction management before he retired. Robert leaned into the story, telling tales of tough projects and long nights, painting himself as a man of grit and accomplishment. Everyone listened with polite interest. I excused myself to refill my glass in the kitchen. I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge, trying to slow my breathing. My reflection in the window looked tired, older than 29. I whispered to myself to just get through the evening. When I returned, the conversation had shifted again. My father was talking about the renovations he had planned for spring, how he would upgrade the deck and host more family gatherings. He did not mention that the last renovation bill had been paid from my savings account. I sat back down and folded my hands in my lap. Around me, laughter resumed, but the undercurrent remained. Everyone had heard his words. Everyone had seen the way he singled me out. The rest of the meal passed in fragments. The clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, the scrape of chairs on hardwood floors. I caught sympathetic glances from my aunt, even from Jessica, but no one spoke up. When dessert was served, pumpkin pie with whipped cream, I forced myself to eat a few bites. My father clapped Ethan on the back, called him the future of the family. My mother laughed a little too loudly at something my uncle said. I kept my head down, counting the minutes until I could leave the table. I knew the night was far from over, and that his outburst was only the beginning of what was coming. Memories from years ago began pushing their way to the front of my mind as I sat there at the table, the voices around me fading into the background. I was no longer 29 staring at half-eaten pumpkin pie. I was 12 again, sitting on the edge of my bed in our old house on Oak Ridge Drive, clutching a blue envelope filled with cash I had saved from babysitting birthday gifts and odd chores for neighbors. Back then, I had worked all year so I could go to a music camp the summer after 7th grade. I wanted to learn the piano properly, not just from the hand-me-down lessons my neighbor had given me when she had time. The envelope was heavy in my hands, almost $400 more money than I had ever saved in my life. I hid it under a stack of school folders in my desk drawer and dreamed about the songs I would play, the new friends I might make, and the independence I would feel being away from home for the first time. One Saturday morning, I went to check on it. The drawer was neat, my folders stacked exactly the way I had left them, but the envelope was gone. Panic set in. I tore through my room, looked under my bed, emptied my backpack twice. Finally, I went to the living room. My father was standing by the new stereo system he had set up, wires running across the floor, speakers taller than I was. He beamed with pride, telling my mother to listen to the clarity of the sound. When I asked if he had seen the envelope, he gave me a look that made my stomach turn cold. He said that money had been sitting there long enough, and it was time it was put to good use. He clapped his hand on the speaker cabinet and told me this was an investment in the family, something we could all enjoy. I opened my mouth to protest, but his glare stopped me. My mother stood by the kitchen counter with her arms crossed, silent as always. I went back to my room and cried quietly into my pillow. That summer, I stayed home while my friends posted photos from camp, smiling with their new friends, showing off the songs they had learned. I avoided the stereo every time it blasted through the house. The music I once loved now felt like a reminder that what was mine was never really mine. It was not the first time he claimed my accomplishments. In 5th grade, when I won the regional spelling bee, the local paper came to take a picture. I remember standing in front of our house holding the little gold trophy, my father beside me, with his arm heavy around my shoulder. When the reporter asked how I had prepared, I started to talk about the hours I had spent with my dictionary and the practice quizzes my teacher had given me. But he cut in telling the reporter that he had drilled me every night, that it was his discipline that made me a champion. The next day's article showed my picture with a quote from him about hard work and family pride. My name was there, but it felt like his story. Even at school events, he made sure to take the spotlight. At my 8th grade science fair, I presented a project on plant growth with different types of soil. I had worked for weeks, keeping careful notes, charting every sprout. When I received a ribbon for 2nd place, he pushed past the parents to shake the teacher's hand and said it was his idea to start the project, that he had always told me to keep a garden. I wanted to correct him, to tell everyone that he had barely looked at my project, but the words stayed locked inside. The pattern became clear early on. If I succeeded, it was because of him. If I failed, it was because I had not listened to him enough. There was no space in between, no acknowledgement that I had dreams or effort of my own. One memory stood out sharper than the rest. In 2011, when I was 16, I applied for a summer internship at the public library downtown. I loved books, loved the quiet, loved the idea of helping people find what they needed. I got accepted, and it felt like the first step towards something that belonged to me. The orientation packet arrived in the mail, and I left it on the kitchen table, proud and excited. That evening, he skimmed through it and tossed it aside. He told me the library would not pay enough, that I should spend the summer working at his friend's hardware store to learn something practical. I begged him to let me do both, but he said no. He even called the library to say I would not be coming. When I found out, I locked myself in my room for hours, clutching the empty packet, feeling like my voice had been erased. Looking back, those were the years when the truth settled in. I did not have a voice in that house. My savings, my achievements, my choices could be claimed or redirected at any moment. The adults around me nodded along with his decisions, and my younger brother Ethan was too small to understand. Even now, sitting at the Christmas table in 2024, I could still feel the weight of that silence. Every time I thought about speaking up, those memories pressed down, reminding me what it felt like to be shut down before I could finish a sentence. I glanced at Ethan across the table. He was grown, now 26, with the same sharp jawline as our father, laughing quietly with Jessica's fiancé. He had never known what it was like to have his savings taken or his victories claimed. He had been shielded, favored, carried. And I sat there remembering the girl. I had been the girl who learned too young that in our house her words meant nothing. I pressed my fork against the pie crust, feeling it crumble under the pressure. Around me, the conversation carried on, but inside my head, the echoes of those years rang louder. I had swallowed my words back then. Tonight, I was not sure how much longer I could keep doing it. The hum of voices rose and fell, and I leaned back in my chair, staring at the string of lights along the window. The glow was soft, almost tender, but inside me the old ache hardened into something else. The night was still unfolding, and I knew it was only a matter of time before those buried memories collided with the present. When I graduated from Ohio State in 2017, holding my degree in elementary education, I felt like my future was finally my own. I had worked hard, taken on student loans, and pushed through years of part-time jobs to keep myself afloat. Stepping into Lincoln Elementary that fall felt like stepping into the life I had dreamed about since I was a little girl, helping out in the library after school. The hallways smelled faintly of crayons and pencil shavings, the bulletin boards bright with student art. I remember the first day I stood in front of my own 3rd grade class. 22 pairs of eyes looked up at me, some shy, some restless, some eager to please. I was terrified, but when one little boy raised his hand and asked if he could call me Miss Miller, my heart swelled. From that day on, the classroom became my sanctuary. Over the years, my students made me laugh, cry, and believe in the importance of what I was doing. Parents thanked me during conferences. I stayed late after school, helping kids who struggled with reading, spent weekends crafting lesson plans that made math feel like a game, and decorated the walls with student projects. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed my effort and encouraged me to apply for leadership workshops. She believed in me, told me I had a gift for reaching children who had given up on themselves. In 2022, I received the district's Innovative Teaching Award. My students and I had created a reading program that paired older students with younger ones, and the improvement in scores was remarkable. At the ceremony, standing under the bright lights in a hotel ballroom, my name was called, and the applause echoed in my ears. I held the plaque in my hands, blinking back tears, and thought about every late night, every stack of graded papers, every moment of doubt that had led me here. I wanted to go home and share the joy. I wanted to set the plaque on the mantel, to see my father's eyes soften with pride just once. Instead, when I walked through the front door that evening carrying the envelope with a small check inside, my father barely looked up from the recliner. "Teaching little kids is fine," he said, "but it is not a career that builds anything. You are wasting your potential." My mother stayed busy in the kitchen, pretending she had not heard. I stood there in the doorway, still holding the award, my cheeks burning. For a second, I thought he was joking, but when he sipped his beer and turned his attention back to the television, I understood he meant every word. The check from the award sat on my dresser for a week. I thought about using it to chip away at my student loans, maybe buy myself a new laptop for lesson planning. But before I could deposit it, my father asked to see it. He said it was a family tradition to celebrate accomplishments together, and that we should throw a party so everyone could recognize how well I was doing. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The following Saturday, our house filled with relatives and neighbors. My father stood at the center of the living room, telling story after story about his years in construction management, how he had instilled discipline in his children, how he had sacrificed to give us opportunities. He waved toward the buffet table piled high with catered food, the bottles of wine lined up on the counter, and announced proudly that he had spared no expense for this celebration. I stood in the corner clutching a cup of soda, the envelope with the award money already gone, knowing full well that the entire event had been paid for by the check with my name on it. No one clapped for me. They clapped for him, for the man who claimed to have built everything. My Aunt Patricia pulled me aside near the end of the night, her voice low. She said she was proud of me, that she had heard about the award, and knew how hard I worked. But even as she spoke, I could hear my father laughing in the next room, retelling a story about how he had forced me to study spelling lists late into the night when I was a child. The irony was not lost on me. Later, after everyone left, I gathered the paper plates and cups, my mother quietly washing dishes beside me. I wanted to ask her why she never spoke up, why she let him take and take, until there was nothing left of me to show. But I bit my tongue. She would only say he meant well, that he wanted the best for me, the same words she always used to excuse his behavior. As I carried the trash bags out to the bin, I glanced back through the window. He was already stretched out in his chair, beer in hand, smiling at the glow of the television. My plaque sat on the mantel where I had placed it, but I knew when he talked about it to anyone else, it would be his story again. In that moment, the realization hit me harder than ever. At school, I was Miss Miller, respected, appreciated, even admired. At home, I was just a prop, another tool for him to prove his own worth. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the heater filling the silence. I should have felt proud. I should have felt joy. Instead, all I felt was the emptiness of knowing my achievements had been swallowed whole by a man who would never give me credit. The next morning, I tucked the plaque back into its box and slid it under my bed. There was no point leaving it on display. In that house, anything with my name on it had a way of becoming his. My brother Ethan always seemed to glide through life with an ease I could never touch. At 26, he was in graduate school at the University of Michigan, studying mechanical engineering, and my father beamed with pride every time his name came up. To my father, Ethan was the future, the one carrying the Miller name forward, with strength and promise. I wanted to be proud of him, too. I remembered helping him with his math homework when he was 12, quizzing him on vocabulary words, cheering when he got into his first choice college. But now, whenever my father bragged about Ethan's accomplishments, a dull ache formed in my chest because I knew what it cost me. The truth was, much of Ethan's tuition and living expenses had come straight from my bank account. It started small when my father asked me to cover Ethan's textbooks one semester because money was tight. He promised he would pay me back. He never did. Then it was groceries, then rent for an off-campus apartment, then another semester's tuition when the bill came due. Every time he pressed the request on me, the words carried weight. If you do not help your brother, you are selfish. Do you want to see him fail? I had my own loans, my own bills, but I always caved. Part of me thought it was my duty as the older sibling, and part of me was terrified of my father's disappointment. He had a way of staring at me until the guilt burned hotter than my anger. One Saturday in early spring, I came home from the grocery store and saw a silver Toyota parked in our driveway. It was shiny, the kind of clean that only comes from a dealership. My father stood next to it with a grin, his arms slung around Ethan's shoulder. My mother hovered nearby, nodding along as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Look at this beauty," my father announced when I got out of my car. "Your brother deserves to drive something reliable while he is in grad school." Ethan smiled awkwardly, running his hand over the hood. I set my grocery bags down on the porch and asked whose car it was. My father puffed up his chest and said he had bought it for Ethan. He explained that a young man with promise needed the right tools to succeed. Something inside me twisted. I knew he did not have the savings for a car like that. I excused myself, quickly carried the bags to the kitchen, and pulled out my phone. I logged into my checking account, my hands trembling. The numbers stared back at me and my heart sank. Thousands of dollars gone. I went back outside, my pulse racing. "Where did you get the money?" I asked, my voice shaking. My father's smile vanished, replaced by the familiar hard edge in his eyes. He said I should not worry about the details. He told me to remember that family comes first, and that Ethan's success would lift us all. "It was my money," I said louder this time. "You used my account." He took a step closer, his jaw tight. "Do not be dramatic, Lauren. You live under my roof and everything in this house is shared. You should be grateful your brother is doing well." Ethan looked at me then, his mouth opening as if he might say something, but he shut it again. His shoulders slumped and he turned back toward the car. I went to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of my bed. The plaque from the teaching award still sat hidden under the frame. Now even the money I worked for, the hours I spent teaching summer school and tutoring, had been poured into a car with my brother's name on it. The unfairness pressed down on me so heavily that I struggled to breathe. I wanted to storm back outside and scream to tell Ethan to hand me the keys and drive it back to the dealership. Instead, I curled my fists into the comforter and swallowed the words like I had so many times before. Dinner that night was unbearable. My father told story after story about how he had gotten a great deal on the car, how he had always planned for Ethan's future, how sacrifices had to be made for the right child. He never once mentioned where the money had come from. My mother passed the rolls silently, her eyes never lifting from her plate. I chewed my food slowly, each bite turning to ash in my mouth. Across the table, Ethan avoided my gaze, fiddling with his fork. I wondered if he knew how much I had given up, or if he believed the story my father told. When I lay down that night, the sound of my father's laughter echoed in my ears. He had turned my savings into another badge of his pride. Ethan had a new car. My father had a new story to tell. And I had another hollow space where my hard work used to be. The resentment began to build steady and sharp like a knife pressed against my ribs. I knew something had to change, though I could not yet see how. For the first time, I began to imagine what it might feel like to live outside that house, away from his shadow, away from the grip he had on everything I touched. The summer heat in Columbus felt heavy that year, clinging to my skin as I carried a bakery box up the steps to my parents' house. Inside was a German chocolate cake, my father's favorite, the frosting decorated with swirls of coconut and pecans. I had spent part of my paycheck to order it from a bakery downtown because I wanted the day to go smoothly. It was his 58th birthday, and I told myself that maybe if everything was perfect, he would not find a reason to turn the spotlight on me. The living room was already crowded when I arrived. My Uncle Tom and Aunt Patricia sat on the sofa, chatting with neighbors. Jessica and her fiancé Michael stood near the kitchen, glasses of iced tea in their hands. My mother moved briskly from room to room, arranging food on platters. Ethan hovered by the new car keys in his pocket, showing them off to a cousin. My father stood in the center of it all, flushed with excitement, welcoming every guest, as though the evening was his crowning moment. I placed the cake on the dining table beside a stack of paper plates, and tried to blend into the background. I had also bought him a leather wallet, simple but sturdy, hoping it might please him. I wrapped it carefully in silver paper and set it discreetly near the gifts. Dinner was served loud and messy, the table filled with barbecue potato salad and corn on the cob. I passed dishes around and laughed at stories, though my stomach felt tight. My father's laughter rose above everyone else's, booming across the room. Every few minutes he reminded his guests how much work he had put into arranging the evening. When it was time for cake, I lit the candles, carried the box to the table, and placed it in front of him. Everyone sang their voices, overlapping in a cheerful off-key chorus. He blew out the candles with a grin, then turned to the crowd and raised his hands. "Thank you, everyone. I made sure this birthday would be one to remember. I spared no expense because family deserves the best." The words made my chest tighten. He gestured at the cake, the food, the decorations, all of it, as though he had pulled it together single-handedly. Not a word about the cake I had carried, the wallet I had bought, or the errands I had run all week. I smiled faintly, pressing my lips together, trying to swallow the sting. After the cake was served, he stood again, tapping a fork against his glass. The room grew quiet, everyone expecting another one of his long toasts. "I want to say how proud I am of my family," he began. "Ethan is working toward his master's degree, carrying the Miller name with strength. Jessica is engaged to a fine young doctor. Everyone here has something to celebrate." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on me. "And then there's Lauren, almost 30, still not married, spending her days babysitting children for a teacher's salary." The words landed with the force of a slap. My cheeks burned as laughter rippled uncomfortably through the crowd. My aunt shifted in her seat. Jessica looked down at her glass. Michael coughed into his hand. My mother busied herself with the plates, pretending she had not heard. I gripped the edge of my chair to keep from shaking. I wanted to defend myself, to tell them about the reading program I had built, the award I had won, the children who lit up when they learned something new in my class. But my throat closed, and the words stayed inside. Instead, I forced a small laugh, pretending it was not tearing me apart. I cut another slice of cake, passed it to a neighbor, and blinked back tears that blurred the candle's glow. My father beamed, pleased with his own joke, raising his glass again, as though he had delivered some grand punchline. The party continued around me, the sound of chatter and clinking glasses filling the air, but I felt distant, as if I were watching from behind glass. My stomach churned, and each bite of cake tasted like ash. I caught Jessica glancing at me, her eyes soft with sympathy, but she said nothing. No one ever did. Later that night, after the guests had gone, I carried the trash bags out to the bins. The cicadas buzzed in the humid air, and I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to steady myself. Inside, I could still hear his laughter, the sound of him recounting the night as though it had been a triumph. I pressed my palms against the cool metal of the trash can, letting the sting of humiliation settle into something sharper. I knew I could not keep living like this, shrinking smaller every time he decided to remind me of my place. Something in me was shifting slowly but surely, and though I had not yet found the strength to speak, I could feel the anger hardening into resolve. When I finally went back inside, the dining table was bare, the candles extinguished. My father sat in his recliner with a satisfied smile, the wallet I had given him unopened on the side table. I slipped past him without a word, carrying the ache with me as I climbed the stairs. In the quiet of my room, I let the tears fall silent and hot. Knowing this humiliation would not be the last, but also knowing that one day I would no longer accept it. The following week, I met Lisa Carter for coffee at a small cafe near downtown Columbus. Lisa had been my friend since college, the kind of friend who never sugarcoated things. She worked as a financial consultant, now sharp as a blade when it came to numbers, and when I walked in and saw her in a tailored blazer with her hair pulled back neatly, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. She noticed the dark circles under my eyes before I even sat down. "What happened this time?" she asked, softly pushing a latte toward me. I told her about the birthday party, about the car, about the way my father paraded around as if everything I earned belonged to him. Lisa listened, her expression tightening as I spoke. When I finished, she leaned closer. "Lauren," she said, "you need to look at your accounts. Really look. Have you tracked where your money is going?" I shook my head, embarrassed. "I pay my bills," I said, "and I try not to think too much about it. He has access to one of my cards, but I never imagined." "That is exactly why you need to check," she interrupted. "Do you have your laptop?" I did. We pulled it out right there in the cafe, the sound of steaming milk and quiet chatter around us as I logged into my online banking. My hands trembled as the numbers appeared on the screen. Lisa guided me, her voice calm but firm. "Look at the transaction history. Scroll back further. No further than that. 3 years worth of charges unfolded in front of me. Hotel stays in Cleveland, electronics purchases from Best Buy, restaurant tabs, far larger than anything I would ever spend." My stomach turned as the amounts added up. Lisa scribbled figures on a napkin, her pen moving quickly. By the time she finished, the total was more than $40,000. I sat frozen, staring at the napkin. 40,000. My breath caught, and my hands began to shake so hard I had to set the laptop down. I whispered that it could not be right, but Lisa looked at me with steady eyes. "It is right. And most of these were charged to a secondary card under your account." "Did you authorize that?" I shook my head, the heat rising in my chest. My father had insisted years ago that it was easier if he had a card for emergencies. I had agreed, not realizing that emergencies meant hotel weekends, new appliances, and gifts he gave away as if they were his own. Tears blurred my vision. Lisa reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "This is financial abuse," she said quietly. "You cannot ignore it." I wanted to stand up and scream, to march home and confront him immediately, but all I could do was sit there with the napkin crumpled in my fist. Every humiliating moment from the past years suddenly had a price tag attached to it, a tangible measure of how much of my life he had taken. Lisa waited until I caught my breath, then pulled out her phone. "I have someone you should talk to," she said. Her name is Karen Wells. She is a lawyer who specializes in family financial cases. She can help you protect yourself. The word lawyer made my stomach clench, but something in me stirred. Maybe this was what I needed. Lisa dialed the number and handed me the phone. Karen's voice was calm and professional. I explained the situation haltingly, my throat tight, and she asked me to gather every statement I could find, every document, every email that proved the pattern. She said we would meet the following week in her office near Broad Street. After the call, I sat in silence, staring at the latte that had gone cold. Lisa leaned back, watching me carefully. "You have been carrying this alone for too long," she said. "It is time to stop letting him take from you." That night, back in my room, I spread the bank statements across my bed. Pages and pages of numbers, each one a small betrayal. My hands shook as I highlighted the charges I did not make. Electronics gas stations in cities I had never driven through, cash withdrawals timed perfectly with the weekends he claimed to be visiting friends. By midnight, my head throbbed, but the truth was undeniable. Over $40,000 in 3 years. Money that could have gone to pay down my loans to help me move out to build a life of my own. Instead, it had built his pride, his stories, his power. I pressed my palms to my eyes, fighting back tears. The girl who once dreamed of music camp, the teacher who stayed late to help her students, the woman who bought cakes and gifts and stayed silent at family gatherings, all of her had been carrying him on her back. When I finally crawled under the covers, the stack of statements sat on my nightstand like a weight, waiting to be lifted. My body ached with exhaustion, but inside me, something new began to stir. The silence I had lived with for so long was cracking, and through the cracks came a flicker of anger that felt almost like freedom. The invitation arrived in the mail a week later, a cream-colored envelope with my cousin Jessica's handwriting across the front. Inside was an elegant card announcing her engagement party with Michael Turner, a medical resident at Riverside Hospital. My Aunt Patricia had written a note at the bottom saying how excited they were to celebrate and how much it would mean if I came. I stared at the card for a long time. Jessica and I were the same age, both 29, but our paths had always been compared, as if they were running in parallel lanes. She was the golden girl of the family kind and capable with a career everyone respected, and now a fiancé with a promising future. I was the teacher, unmarried, still living in the same house where I had grown up, quietly funding a lifestyle that my father flaunted as his own. On the evening of the party, I drove to the Harris home in Bexley. Their house glowed with string lights and cars lined the street. Inside, the smell of catered food mixed with the sound of laughter. Jessica greeted me with a warm hug, her eyes bright, the diamond on her finger catching the light. Michael stood beside her, tall and polite, shaking everyone's hand. The living room buzzed with conversation. Guests clustered in small groups, sipping champagne and praising the couple. My father quickly inserted himself into the circle, near the fireplace, his voice carrying above the others, as he boasted about the strong future of the Harris family, now that Jessica was marrying a doctor. He clapped Michael on the back as if he had personally arranged the match. I tried to enjoy myself, chatting with cousins and nibbling on appetizers, but I felt the tension creeping in as my father's voice grew louder. He thrived in moments like this, surrounded by relatives, every ear waiting for his pronouncements. At dinner, long tables stretched across the backyard under a canopy of lights. Plates were filled with roast beef, roasted vegetables, and fresh rolls. I sat between my Aunt Patricia and Jessica, who leaned close to whisper about wedding plans. I smiled and nodded, genuinely happy for her, but a part of me braced for the inevitable moment when the spotlight would turn. It came during the toasts. My Uncle Tom spoke first, thanking everyone for coming. Michael followed, his words humble and heartfelt, as he spoke about how lucky he felt to have Jessica in his life. The applause was warm, the glasses raised high. Then my father rose, holding his wine like a scepter. Family, he began, his tone already thick with pride. Tonight we celebrate Jessica, who has always made us proud. She has chosen a man with ambition, a man with a future, a man who will provide for her the way a husband should. The crowd murmured approval, smiling toward Jessica and Michael. My chest tightened. I knew where this was heading. And then, as if on cue, his eyes found me. And of course, my daughter Lauren. She teaches little kids. It is fine work, I suppose, but not quite the same. Babysitting children all day is not what I imagined when I thought about her future. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. I forced a smile, my lips trembling as heat rushed to my face. The table shifted uncomfortably. Jessica's eyes widened, and she reached for my hand under the table, giving it a squeeze. My Aunt Patricia cleared her throat softly, but no one spoke against him. I laughed lightly, a sound that felt brittle in my chest, pretending it did not cut me. I stared at my plate, tracing circles on the edge with my fork, and told myself to keep breathing. Inside, though, something hardened. The humiliation of that summer birthday party, the discovery of my drained accounts, the years of being silenced and diminished, they all swirled together into a steady flame. I smiled for the room, but inside I whispered a promise to myself. This would be the last time he used me as a punchline. The rest of the evening blurred. Music played, couples danced in the backyard, champagne flowed freely. My father laughed loudly at his own jokes, retelling the same lines to different groups of relatives. I moved through the crowd, keeping my head high, though each step felt heavier with the weight of his words. When I left later that night, Jessica hugged me tight at the door. "I am sorry," she whispered. "He should not have said that. You are amazing, Lauren." I nodded, forcing another smile, and walked to my car under the glow of the streetlights. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel. In the silence of the drive home, the promise echoed in my head louder with each mile. The next time he tried to shame me, I would not stand quietly and swallow it whole. Something had to change, and I was ready to make sure it did. The library smelled of fresh paint and old paper the night I met David Brooks. Lincoln Elementary had hosted a district-wide event, pairing teachers with local librarians to brainstorm new reading initiatives, and I had reluctantly signed up. I walked into the community room with my binder full of notes, expecting another long evening of polite chatter. But instead I found myself standing across from a man with kind eyes and a crooked smile, who introduced himself as the head librarian at Worthington Public. David was 31, tall and slightly rumpled, with a stack of note cards poking out of his jacket pocket. When we began talking, the conversation flowed easily. We shared frustrations about outdated curriculum standards, laughed about the odd things kids said during story time, and discovered a mutual love for the classics. He confessed he reread To Kill a Mockingbird every summer. I admitted I kept a copy of Little Women by my bedside. Over the next hour, we traded ideas like old friends. He described a program he wanted to start that allowed kids to check out books bundled with board games to encourage family reading nights. I told him about my classroom library, where students left handwritten notes in the covers for the next reader. He leaned closer when I spoke, as if every word mattered. It was the first time in years that I felt heard without interruption. When the session ended, he asked if I would like to grab coffee sometime to continue the conversation. I agreed, surprised at my own excitement. Over the following weeks, coffee turned into dinner, dinner turned into long walks through Goodale Park, and I began to feel the walls around me soften. David was thoughtful and steady, never rushing me, never making me feel small, but eventually our paths crossed with my father. It happened one Sunday evening when I invited David to a family dinner, hoping to ease him into the chaos gradually. He brought a bottle of wine and complimented my mother's roast, shaking hands politely with my uncle and cousins. For a while, everything was calm. My father even seemed in good spirits, talking about football and asking David about his work. Then the shift came sharp and sudden. My father leaned back in his chair, narrowed his eyes, and asked how much a librarian really made these days. David answered honestly, explaining the modest salary, but emphasizing how much he loved the work. My father chuckled, shaking his head. "2 people in education," he said loudly. "Now that is a recipe for being broke your whole lives." The table went quiet. My face burned, and I wished I could sink through the floor. Normally, I would have smiled tightly, changed the subject, anything to smooth the edges. But David did not look away. He met my father's eyes calmly and said that money was not the only measure of a meaningful life. My father scoffed, waving him off, already turning to my brother Ethan to brag about his engineering degree. The conversation shifted, but the sting remained. I busied myself clearing plates, my chest tight, my hands unsteady. After dinner, when the guests had left and the house had quieted, David asked me to take a walk. We strolled down the quiet street, the glow of porch lights flickering in the humid air. He was silent for a while, letting me breathe before finally speaking. "Lauren," he said gently, "I need to tell you something. You do not have to keep living like that. I stopped in my tracks, my throat tightening. He looked at me with steady eyes, not pitying, just certain. I saw the way he speaks to you, he continued. The way he cuts you down, takes what is yours, makes you feel like less. It is not right. My vision blurred. I tried to brush it off, muttering that it was just the way my father was, that he had always been that way. David shook his head. No, he said, it is not just the way he is. It is the way he treats you. And you have the right to demand better. The tears came suddenly, hot and unstoppable. I covered my face with my hands, my body trembling with years of swallowed words. David wrapped his arms around me, holding me steady as the sobs shook through. When I finally pulled back, embarrassed, he handed me a tissue from his pocket. His voice was quiet but firm. You are stronger than you think, Lauren. You have been carrying everyone else for so long that you forgot you can carry yourself. I nodded, my chest aching but lighter somehow. For the first time in years, I felt like I was not alone in this fight. There was someone who saw me clearly, someone who believed I deserved more than humiliation and silence. As we walked back to the house, my hand brushed against his and I let it linger there. The night air felt different, charged with something I had not felt in a long time. Hope. December came quickly, bringing with it gray skies and the smell of pine needles in every store I walked through. While families around Columbus hung wreaths and wrapped presents, I was hunched over my desk late at night, sorting papers into neat piles that made my stomach turn. Bank statements, tuition receipts, wire transfers, even photocopies of checks with my signature forged in familiar handwriting. Each page was a piece of the puzzle I had ignored for too long. Karen Wells had told me to gather everything. Her office on Broad Street smelled faintly of coffee and leather, the shelves stacked with thick binders. She was calm, efficient, and direct. Bring me the proof, she had said, and I will do the rest. So I worked quietly, slipping documents into my bag when my parents were out printing statements in the staff lounge at school, highlighting charges I knew were never mine. David sometimes sat with me in the evenings, a book open in his lap, while I pored over the numbers. Every so often he would reach across the table and squeeze my hand, reminding me that I was not doing this alone. His steadiness kept me from drowning in the fear that rose whenever I thought about what would happen if my father discovered what I was planning. By mid-December, the binder was full. Karen flipped through it page by page, her brow furrowing deeper with each line. More than 40,000, she murmured, and all tied directly to your account. She looked up at me. This is clear cut. We can file to have the accounts frozen and his access revoked. The words both relieved and terrified me. What would he do when he realized the well had run dry? Karen leaned forward, her tone firm. He cannot keep taking from you. You have a right to protect your own earnings, but you need to be ready for the fallout. I nodded, swallowing hard. Ready or not, the time had come. The following days passed in a blur of routine at school and secret phone calls during planning periods. Karen filed the paperwork, moving with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. She promised me that everything would be in place before Christmas. At home, I kept my face neutral, sitting through dinners, while my father bragged about the gifts he had bought, never realizing that the card he used was on borrowed time. My mother planned the Christmas menu, scribbling lists and humming carols, oblivious to the storm building beneath her roof. The weight of the secret pressed on me. In the quiet of my room, I rehearsed what I would say when the truth surfaced, though my chest tightened each time I imagined his fury. Still beneath the fear, there was a steady current of determination. On December 24th, I was at school tidying my classroom for winter break when my phone buzzed. It was Karen. I stepped into the empty hallway, my hands trembling as I answered. Her voice was calm but carried a note of satisfaction. It is done, she said. The accounts are officially frozen. His access has been revoked. He cannot touch your money anymore. For a moment, I could not breathe. Relief flooded me so fast my knees nearly buckled. I pressed my back against the lockers, clutching the phone as tears stung my eyes. Karen continued explaining the next steps, but her words blurred in my ears. All I could hear was the quiet roar of freedom. When I hung up, I stood there in the empty hallway, staring at the snow falling outside the windows. The fear was still there, yes, but it was different now, edged with resolve. For the first time in my life, my father no longer had control of everything I earned. That evening, David met me for coffee, and I told him what Karen had said. He smiled, his eyes warm with pride. "You did it, Lauren. You finally drew the line." I nodded, wrapping my hands around the mug, letting the heat sink into my skin. The war was not over, I knew that. Christmas dinner was only a day away, and my father would soon discover what had been taken from him. But sitting there in that cafe, listening to the hum of holiday music, I allowed myself one rare moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring its own battle. Tonight I let myself believe that I had already won the first one. The morning of December 25th began with a thin layer of snow covering the sidewalks, the kind of quiet dusting that made everything look softer than it really was. I woke early, nerves rattling in my chest as I dressed in a simple green sweater and black skirt, something festive but plain. My hands shook slightly as I braided my hair, knowing the night ahead would not be like any Christmas we had ever had before. By late afternoon, the house was full of motion. My mother busied herself in the kitchen, basting the turkey and mashing potatoes with the precision of someone trying to hold a family together by force of habit. The smell of cinnamon rolls drifted from the oven, mingling with the scent of garlic and herbs. My father moved from room to room, straightening decorations and puffing out his chest like a man preparing for a performance. He wore a deep red sweater and carried a glass of bourbon even before the guests arrived. I sat on the couch binder, hidden under my bed upstairs, the knowledge of frozen accounts tucked like a secret in my pocket. Every ornament on the tree shimmered under the string lights, and all I could think was how many of them had been charged to my card. The stockings hanging by the fireplace, the pile of presents wrapped in glossy paper, the catered cheese board waiting on the table. Each one was evidence of my labor, my sacrifice. By 5 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and relatives spilled into the house. Jessica and Michael arrived with a bottle of wine, their cheeks red from the cold. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Tom followed carrying a casserole dish. Ethan strolled in, last keys to his new car dangling casually from his hand, smiling as though the whole world belonged to him. My father greeted each guest with booming laughter, shaking hands, clapping backs, acting every inch the generous patriarch. Dinner was served on the long dining table, covered in a white cloth and topped with gold-rimmed plates. A turkey carved perfectly at the center, bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans cranberry sauce, in a crystal dish pumpkin pie cooling nearby. The hum of conversation filled the air as guests passed dishes, glasses clinked, and carols played faintly from the stereo. My father raised his glass. "Family," he declared, "I am proud to provide this meal, this home, this gathering. Everything you see here I make possible." A heavy silence stirred inside me. My eyes flicked to the garlands around the windows, the gifts stacked under the tree, the wine he was holding. I had seen every receipt, filed them away in my binder, each one marked in my bank statements. His voice boomed with pride, but it was hollow to me because I knew the truth. As the meal went on, he grew bolder. Between bites of turkey and swigs of bourbon, he bragged about paying Ethan's tuition, about buying the car in the driveway, about covering the Christmas expenses without blinking. He even gestured toward Jessica, praising her engagement, then added that at least one child had made smart choices. I felt heat rising in my cheeks. My fork scraped against the plate, my pulse hammering in my ears. I opened my mouth once, ready to speak, but my father's glare caught me before the words could form. He leaned forward, his voice cutting sharp as a blade. "Do not embarrass me again. You make me look weak when you run your mouth." The clatter of silverware died instantly. Chairs shifted, and a hush fell over the room. His words sliced through the air, leaving nothing but the sound of the fire crackling in the corner. My mother froze with a serving spoon in her hand, her knuckles white. Ethan's smirk faded, and even Jessica lowered her eyes to her lap. For a moment, I sat perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat. Then something inside me clicked into place. I pushed back my chair slowly, the legs scraping across the hard wood, and stood. My knees trembled, but my voice came steady, ringing louder than I expected. Then stop spending my money and stop taking credit for my success. The words dropped into the silence like stones. Every eye at the table turned to me. My father's mouth opened, but no sound came. His face reddened, his jaw clenched, his hand tightened around the stem of his glass until I thought it might shatter. Jessica gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. Aunt Patricia looked away, shame flickering across her face. My Uncle Tom cleared his throat but said nothing. Ethan stared down at his plate, suddenly fascinated by the mashed potatoes. I held his gaze, refusing to shrink. Years of swallowed humiliation rose up behind me like a wall, and for the first time I stood firmly in front of it. The silence stretched on. The Christmas lights blinked cheerfully, mocking the stillness in the room. Even the music had stopped, the stereo humming low, as if it too was waiting for the next move. Finally, my father set down his glass with a sharp thud. His eyes bore into mine, filled with rage and disbelief. But I did not flinch. My hands trembled at my sides, yet my shoulders stayed straight. No one dared speak. My mother lowered her spoon, her lips pressed thin. Jessica's eyes shone with tears, though she stayed quiet. The weight of the moment pressed on all of us, a truth finally spoken aloud, impossible to take back. I drew a slow breath, my chest rising with a calm I had never known at that table. For once the room belonged to me, not to his voice, not to his performance, not to his false pride. The silence deepened, stretching long and heavy, until it seemed the walls themselves were listening. And in that stillness I knew everything had already changed. When the last of the guests slipped on coats and murmured awkward goodbyes, the house settled into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the front door closing. I stood in the dining room clearing plates, my hands moving automatically while my chest still thrummed with the echo of what I had said. The Christmas lights twinkled above the window, cheerful against the tension that hung like smoke in the air. My father's footsteps were slow, but deliberate as he entered the room. His face was flushed, his jaw rigid, the kind of look that used to make me shrink into myself as a child. Not this time. He slammed his hand against the back of a chair, making the silverware rattle. "You made me look like a fool," he spat. "In front of family, in front of everyone. How dare you turn on me like that?" I stacked plates in silence, refusing to drop my gaze. His voice grew louder. "After everything I have done for you, this is how you repay me. You would rather humiliate your own father than show respect." Finally, I set the plates down and reached for the folder I had hidden earlier. The crisp edges of the papers steadied me. I placed it on the table and opened it, sliding the bank statements across the wood until they rested under his hand. His eyes flickered downward, then back up at me. "These are my accounts," I said quietly but firmly. "Every dollar you took, every charge you made, every lie you told is here in black and white." He shoved the papers back toward me, his face reddening further. "That money is family money. My house, my rules." "Not anymore," I answered, my voice trembling but steady. "The accounts are frozen. You do not have access anymore." For a moment he looked stunned, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. My mother rushed in from the kitchen, her apron still on, her eyes flashing. "How could you speak to your father this way?" she shouted. "After all his sacrifices, you bring this shame on Christmas night." Her words cut, but I held my ground. "Those sacrifices were mine," I said. "The tuition, the car, the food on this table, all of it came from me." He just wrapped it in his pride and called it his own. The room fell still again, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. Then Ethan, who had been standing near the doorway, finally spoke. His voice was low, almost hesitant, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "She is not wrong." All eyes turned to him. My father blinked as if he had misheard. My mother's mouth fell open. Ethan shifted on his feet, his face pale, but he did not look away from me. For years I had dreamed of hearing those words of someone in the family acknowledging the truth. Now in that moment, it felt both surreal and powerful. My father's hand clenched into a fist on the table. "You ungrateful boy," he growled, turning his anger toward Ethan. But Ethan did not flinch. He glanced at me again, and for the first time I saw something other than indifference in his eyes. Recognition. I drew a deep breath, feeling my shoulders straighten. "I am moving out," I announced. My voice was steady, final. "I will no longer live in this house, and I will no longer pay for any of this." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother's eyes filled with tears of fury, not sadness. My father's face contorted, struggling between rage and disbelief. "You would abandon your family," he demanded, his voice hoarse. "You would walk away from us after everything we built." I met his gaze head on. "You built nothing," I said softly. "I built it. And now I am done." The words settled into the room like the final note of a hymn. No one moved, no one spoke. The tree lights blinked on and off, reflecting in the dark windows. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight lift. I was terrified, yes, but beneath the fear was something stronger. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was a decision. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into a life I had once only imagined. I signed a lease on a small apartment on the north side of Columbus. Nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom with pale blue walls and sunlight that poured in each morning through wide windows. For the first time, every dollar I earned stayed in my account. I paid my own rent, bought my own groceries, and filled the space with secondhand furniture that felt more like luxury than anything in my parents' house because it was mine. At school, my classroom became even more of a sanctuary. My students greeted me each morning with their boundless energy, and I poured myself into lesson plans and reading games. Parents began stopping me after conferences to thank me, not just politely, but sincerely, telling me their children had grown under my care. Mrs. Rodriguez encouraged me to apply for a district leadership position, opening the following year. Instead of hearing my father's mocking voice in my head, I started to believe the compliments were real. David was by my side through all of it. He carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs the day I moved, laughed with me when the couch got stuck in the stairwell, and stayed late helping me hang shelves. On quiet nights, he cooked pasta while I graded papers at the kitchen table, his presence a steady reminder that not all men thrived on control. We built something together, piece by piece, with kindness and honesty. For the first time, I let myself imagine a future without fear. Back at my parents' house, things began to unravel. Without my money flowing silently into their accounts, the facade cracked quickly. My father could no longer host elaborate dinners or buy extravagant gifts. Relatives whispered when invitations stopped arriving. At church, people began to notice when the donations dwindled and the stories he told no longer matched reality. The man who had once strutted with pride now avoided conversations that turned toward finances. I heard pieces of it from Ethan, who called me one evening from his campus apartment. His voice was subdued, almost careful, when he admitted that things were different at home. "Dad is angry all the time," he said, "but people are starting to see it." He paused before adding quietly, "You were right to leave." Those words mattered more than he probably knew. It was not an apology, but it was acknowledgement, and for the first time I felt like maybe the cycle would not claim him the way it had threatened to claim me. My mother still tried to reach me, leaving voicemails laced with anger one day and pleading the next. I answered less and less. Each time I hung up, the distance grew wider, but so did the peace inside me. I had stopped waiting for her to defend me. I had stopped waiting for him to change. By spring, the apartment had become home. I filled the shelves with books, David, and I picked out together, planted a small herb garden on the windowsill, and painted the kitchen chairs a cheerful yellow. On Saturday mornings, sunlight spilled across the table where we drank coffee and planned our day. I laughed more, slept better, and no longer carried the constant knot of dread in my stomach. One evening in April, Jessica visited. She brought flowers and sat on my couch, her eyes scanning the little apartment. She smiled, saying it felt warm and safe, and then she grew serious. She told me she admired me, that watching me stand up at Christmas had given her courage in her own life. Tears stung my eyes as I realized that my defiance had not only freed me, it had shown others that silence was not the only option. As for my father, his voice no longer held power over me. He still raged, still tried to twist the story, but the truth had already spread. His image as the generous provider collapsed, replaced by the reality of a man who had lived off the labor of his daughter. Karma had come quietly but firmly, stripping away the pride he wore like armor. I stood in my small apartment one evening, looking around at the mismatched furniture, the bookshelf full of notes from students, the framed photo of David and me laughing in the park. For the first time, the word freedom did not feel like a dream or a decision. It was simply my life. And now, as I share this story, I want to leave you with this. Families can wound us in ways no one else can, but we are not powerless. Sometimes love means walking away, choosing respect for yourself over silence for others. If you have ever faced something like this, I invite you to share your experience in the comments. I would love to know how you found your own voice. And if my story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories of resilience, justice, and unexpected strength. Thank you for listening, and remember, you deserve to be treated with dignity, always.